Morning and welcome to the Well. If we haven't had a chance to meet you, my name is Danny. As JT said, I'm one of the pastors here as well, and just excited and glad you're in worship with us today. Especially if it is your first time, it takes a lot of courage to come and try any church, especially a new church. Even if you were invited by a friend or a family member, it's a big step. And so we're just excited that you would come and that you would join us for that. And as he said, we're kicking off a new sermon series called The Least of These, where we're looking at how the Christmas story is not just for those that are centered and not just for those of us that know the story and not just for those of us that have always heard or maybe even believe the story, but the Christmas story at its core is a story that is for, as Jesus would put it, the least of these. And so we're looking at a passage that is traditionally not a Christmas passage. It actually comes many years after the birth of Jesus, but uttered by Jesus himself, where he said that if you didn't do this for the least of these, you didn't do it for me. If you didn't serve the least of these, and he talks about the poor and the hungry and the sick and the imprisoned and the naked and all these people. If you didn't do anything for them, you didn't do it for me. But if you did do it for them, then you did it for me. And so we're looking at how that ethos and that message that Jesus preaches 30 years after his birth is actually at the core of what the Christmas story is all about. And what I wanted to do, and we've not done this in a while, but I want to take a moment to open us up with conversation. I know you just welcomed each other, and if you're new, you've never seen us do this before, so everything's new to you, but sometimes we'll turn and we'll have conversations with each other and try to get things going. Someone asked me why I do that, and I'm like, well, here's the reality, and this isn't trying to be self-deprecating here, but stats show that you will not remember most of the things I say in 5 minutes, maybe 5 years. But what you will remember are the things you said to each other. That's how theology and faith become sticky, is having real conversations with one another. And I think that God certainly speaks through this time, but the conversation that you guys have with one another often is more sticky than anything that we could ever say from up here. We're cultivating theology together. This isn't unilateral. This is kind of connected in that regard. So I would love you to take a moment and with someone around you, maybe someone you came with, and so you don't have to introduce yourself, but if it's someone you don't know, introduce yourself and say hello. But when you think about the idea of the Christmas story being for the least of these, have you ever considered that? And if so, why? And if not, what does that idea stir in you? The idea that the Christmas story is not just for some, but for all, not just for those that have, but for the least of these. And so take a second, chat with those around you. We'll come back together in 30 seconds or a minute or so. So chat for a second. I'll be interested to hear some of the conversations you maybe had afterwards. After the first service, I chatted with someone and they're like, I had such a deep conversation. And I was like, in 30 seconds? That's amazing. But I love that. The idea that you can have meaningful, significant conversations that aren't just this way, but are all of us together, wrestling with and talking about it and saying, what does this look like for us? And so one of the things that I want us to do, and if you've been around the Well for a while, you know that I have been pitching a sermon series on the book of Leviticus since I got to the Well. And every time I tell someone, they're like, please, Lord, don't do that sermon series. We don't want to talk about Leviticus. It's an old, outdated book. It's oftentimes used to marginalize people. It's a pretty tough read. But I would say it's actually a really interesting read, and one that points to, in many ways, the character of who God is and the fabric of God's character. And I love that because when we look at our own lives, they're messy. Right? We think we have good character, but we look at the totality of our life. Sometimes it doesn't always look the way we would hope that it would. And Leviticus, just on its own, is an amazing book about trying to draw people back to the character of God and try to draw people into an abundant level of life, even when our natural disposition is to live outside of that. And so when you think about the Christmas story, you often probably don't imagine it beginning in the book of Leviticus. But I want to take us back there because it shows us the idea that even from the very beginning, so Leviticus is the third book in the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, and then Leviticus. And so this is after their time of slavery and wandering in captivity. They've had some really big hardships. And in the moment of this time, God speaks to God's people and gives them an invitation, but also gives them a challenge. So it says this in Leviticus 19, starting in verse 33. It'll be on the screens, or you can open your Bibles and read with me. It says, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress that stranger. The stranger who resides with you shall be with you as a native among you, and you shall love the stranger as you love yourself. That might sound familiar, right? It sounds a little bit like the words of Jesus, love your neighbor as you love yourself. For when you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and this is why he's saying that you ought to love them. For you were strangers once as well. And then he says, I am the Lord your God. And this is an amazing passage for me. When I read this, it's easy for us as Christians to skip to the New Testament, right? To skip to the Gospels, go to the Christmas story, and see this baby born in a manger, and see Jesus grow up, and look at his miracles and his teaching, all wonderful, amazing things. Really formative and transformative things. But it's easy to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, the Old Testament's not that meaningful, or it's complicated, or it's messy, or there's nothing of value there. And when you go all the way back to Leviticus, one of the toughest reads in all of the Bible, and we look at it, we see at the core of it is an invitation from God to God's people saying, hey, in the midst of everything, I want you to do one thing. Always welcome the stranger. Always welcome those that are outside of you. And then he gives them a reminder, because don't you remember that time when you were that person? And for some of them, like maybe it was passed along through family tradition, or maybe some experience of themselves, or whatever the story might be, but they would have had visceral memories of what slavery and wandering and captivity was like, generations sharing the story about oppression and wandering and wilderness, and probably sharing stories in their wandering when someone welcomed them, and they remembered the hospitality that someone showed them, but also the feeling it felt like to be on the outside. And this is a reminder that God is trying to give God's people, that once you become an insider, once you find your seat at the table, once you find connection and community and hospitality, it is sometimes easy, disposition-wise, to stop caring about those who don't have one. Like, that's kind of the challenge in this verse here in Leviticus. He's like, don't you guys remember? Like, at one point, you were wanderers. At one point, you guys were strangers. At one point, you were people without a home. And I want you to remember two things. One, that was you. And two, do you remember how good it felt when someone welcomed you? How holy and sacred that space was? And I want you to go and to continue to do that thing, to live that out. And Leviticus 19 as a whole is a chunk of Leviticus known as like the Holiness Code. And that includes 18 and 19, and it has like really hard things in it. Often passages used to condemn queer people can be found in there. But also you find these invitations like this to love your neighbor, commands about justice and fairness and generosity, ways to treat workers, the poor, and the marginalized, how to kind of have a blueprint to be people after God's own heart. And at the core of all of those, the good, the bad, the ugly, the indifferent, the things that we have a hard time with, and the things that aren't as hard to wrestle with, are an encouragement in all of it to be people of hospitality and to be people that create space for other people. And that would actually be interesting. I would challenge you. This isn't a sermon series on Leviticus. I'm not trying to make it that. But I would challenge you to go back and read Leviticus and find the things that you find challenging and the things that are frustrating and the things that don't align with your current ethics and values, and read them all through the lens of what would happen if this wasn't like a moral mandate, but a mandate to like love strangers. What would happen if this was an ethical mandate, but a mandate to love strangers? Like all of the book, if you read it through the lens of creating space for the stranger or the foreigner or the outsider, like it actually changes the whole lens of the book, which is what the book of Leviticus at its core was really trying to push its readers to read. And before Leviticus was a book, it was just a story that was shared with people. And then they were like, well, this is a bad way for quality control, so we have to write this down. But initially, it was just a reminder of like, what does it mean to be people after God's own heart, people modeled in the character of God, and that starts and ends with creating seats for people and having circles that get bigger, not smaller. And what's interesting, if you look in the Hebrew, the word for stranger is the word ger, and it's this interesting, it'll be on the screen actually, and it can be translated like sojourner, stranger, foreigner, alien, but it also has like other meanings as well, like immigrant and refugee, someone without land, status, or legal protection. That would be like a way to translate it. Also someone that is entirely at the mercy of the dominant culture. And that's an interesting way to read it, because like then that means like we could be in our own city, in our own town, in our own country, but we walk into a space and we're the only, like, there's a dominant culture. We could feel like the stranger in there. So it's like somewhat geographical, but it's somewhat circumstantial. It can hit us in different ways, and it gives us the complexity of the word, saying that like many of us, regardless of our country of origin or our experience or socioeconomic status or our gender or ethnicity, whatever, like we can all feel like an outsider. Like we can all feel like a stranger depending on the spaces that we occupy and we go into. But God, in the midst of all of that, starting in Leviticus, gives a commandment, right? To treat your neighbor exactly as you would treat the native, as the insider, as the person that's already a part of the group. Treat the person who is on the outside, not only how you would want to be treated, but treat them as someone that belongs and has their seat at the table. And what's interesting is like this isn't a mandate to be nice. It's not even a mandate to be polite. or to be tolerant. That's like one of my biggest frustrations about conversations of like including people, outsiders. Like this is not a conversation about tolerance. This is a conversation about belonging and like creating space for people to not be tolerated and not be polite to them and not be nice to them, but actually change like the fabric of the room to say like you belong and you have a seat and you're welcome here. It's not about tribalism. It's not about any of that. It's about equity and solidarity and coming together is what God is pushing the people in Leviticus to understand. Trying to say like empathy and community are actually like acts and manifestations of holiness. And so when we look at this, like you might be like, when are we going to talk about the manger, right? Like when are we going to talk about Christmas? Long before Jesus was ever in a manger, before he was ever born there and any of this happened, the Christmas story was beginning to be shaped by people that were understanding like what does it mean to welcome those on the outside? What does it mean to welcome those who are the stranger? And consistently, God's people vacillated between doing this well and doing this very poorly, doing this in ways that were really abundant, in ways that were almost non-existent. And I think that's why God chose the way God did for the Christmas story to come to be, right? Like think about the way Jesus comes into the world. Like he doesn't come into a throne. He doesn't come into a castle. He doesn't come into even like the VIP room of the inn or the hotel. Like he's born in a manger. And we like sometimes like stylize and idealize the manger. Like you've driven by a church, right? You see like the little hut house with the beautiful like straw on it and like the horses and the goats and the donkeys and the wise men. They all look like they're just like having the greatest time ever. I went to Israel 4 or 5 years back, and I went into a place like this is what this would have looked. It's like a rock cave. Like it's not a good time, guys. Like it's not a place that you would ever want to hang out. And like when you're looking at like where Jesus was born into, he was born into an unwed teenage mother to a guy who had no real status in his world, in Joseph and Mary. It was born not in a space that was occupied, but the overflow space that no one wanted, where the animals would often go. He was born into like obscurity and certainly outside of the circle. And I think that's not by accident, right? Like that doesn't seem like God dropped the ball on like making a reservation for Jesus at the end, right? Like doesn't seem like God was like doing something, but like God was pointing back, even in the birth of Jesus, the idea of God incarnate, God with us, Emmanuel, which means God dwelling with us and being among us, that who is God among and with? And where do we find that? In often the least expected places, in the outside places, in the margins, revealing the truth that there really is no outsider, but it's our job to continue to expand and create more space for the circle. And so Jesus, with this in his mind, like he's born in this nobody town to these nobody people in a throwaway space. And then fast forward, like his life and his ministry goes on 30 or so years later, and Jesus is out and he's walking around, he encounters these people and he says to them, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And I have to imagine that Leviticus was in his mind. I have to imagine that his birth story was in his mind. And what happened after his birth when they were refugees in another country because they had to flee, I have to imagine that was in his mind. Like his family early on knowing that they were strangers in a different land because people were out to kill the infant Jesus because they heard about this new king coming. Like everything about Jesus' story, from what paved the way to the way it came to be, was a story about someone that experienced life on the outside. And Jesus says, whatever you did for the least of these, talking about the unhoused and the naked, the sick, the prisoner, the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger that we're talking about this week, whatever you did for those people, you did for me. Because Jesus is like, I've been all of those things. And I've been all of those places. And so have you, and many of you, like we've been that outsider. And if you've loved those people in that way, then you have loved me, and not just loved me okay, but you've loved me well, and you've loved me perfectly in a way that includes these people that are often told they're on the outside, that feel like to them love is a stranger and friendship is a stranger. And what's interesting is like, there's not many books before Leviticus, it's the third book, but go back 2 books further to Genesis, the opening of the Bible. Like God gives Abraham, kind of the father of the nations, so to speak, a promise. In Genesis 15, he says, you're going to have more descendants than the stars in the sky. And Sadie preached about their story a little bit. Like Abraham had a hard time and didn't even imagine they would be able to like have one descendant, right? That was something that like was maybe up for debate on whether it was going to happen. So the idea that God would be like, well, you're not just going to have one son, but you're going to have more descendants than the stars in the sky would have been like, that seems pretty wild to me, that would be possible, right? And making this circle and this family for everyone. But God even gives a reminder in this moment, which is the same reminder that we see in Leviticus and the same reminder that we see Jesus giving as he says, if you did this for the least of these, he says, but your nation, these descendants that are more numerous than the stars in the sky, it isn't just about you. Your nation is, and your descendants are supposed to be a blessing, not just to themselves, but to the world. Like this isn't just a you guys thing. And so from Genesis to Leviticus to all of the Christmas stories in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's this continual reminder that God shows up in places that are often unexpected. That God shows up in places where people are often told they are on the outside and will never be on the inside. Like God continues to show up in places, reminding those that are not centered, that are on the margins, that are on the outside, that the Christmas story is not just about those who have all their stuff together. It's not just about those who already have a seat at the table, though it's certainly for those people. Like as we talk about creating seats for other people, I always want to remind us that someone else's seat doesn't cost yours, right? So if you have your seat, that's like the greatest gift you could ever have. And I'm so happy you have that and know that and embrace that. But the Christmas story and Abraham's story and the reminder in Leviticus in Jesus' own words, he says, if you did this for the least of these, is a really important reminder that the story that God has been writing has never been about us versus them, it's about us. And the way that we create us is by making sure everyone knows they belong. And so I began to ask myself like this week, well, how do we then make sure people know that they belong? Like, how do we do that? Because that's like the real meat and potatoes of it. Like, how do we actually go about living this out? And I think the first thing we have to do is like not fear the stranger. We have to actually embrace them. And this is the challenge that's in the book of Leviticus. Like, that is the core tension. Is that like they were in slavery and then they found freedom and they're like, well, if we welcome anyone, we're opening ourselves up to be hurt again, right? Like we need to keep strangers because it's the only way to keep safety. I mean, even Jesus, right? Like Jesus was this newborn thrust into this world, and then there were ripples about who he was and who he might be. And so like the kings of the time were like, well, we got to erase this family and this kid. And they were fearful of the other, fearful of the stranger, fearful of what might come. And I think for us to be people that like actually start to erase some of those lines, we have to not fear strangers, we have to embrace them. And that comes with a level of like risk. Like that's like, not the safest choice all the time. I don't think that means opening yourself up for like harm or abuse or anything like that, but it is a bold and courageous and really brave choice to say like, I'm not going to be fearful of strangers. I'm going to be someone that welcomes them, especially in a world that gives us narratives built around why we should be afraid of people that we don't know, that don't look like us, don't act like us, don't think like us, or whatever. Like, it's a bold and brave choice to say, I'm actually going to be about doing the opposite of that. Rather than being fearful of strangers, I'm going to embrace them. But then we also, like, if we're going to do that, we have to be about not just protecting our tribe or our team and actually, like, widening our circles. One of my favorite things about this church is we have like a pretty wide spectrum of like football fandoms in this church. Like people, more football team fandoms represented here than any other church I've ever been a part of. And we treat faith like that sometimes. Like I am this team's fan, and by being that, I have to hate everyone else, right? Or I'm on this team, and because I'm on this team, everyone else is my enemy. I mean, Sadie's not even a Jets fan, but you guys probably all think she's a Jets fan because she's got a Jets jersey on. Like, but what if we treated our teams like? What if we just like put on clothes of the team that fit that week, right? Like what if we stopped saying that this was about our tribe and it was actually about widening the circle? Like what would happen if we did that? Sadie, can you name anyone on the Jets? No. Great. What would happen if we stopped treating it like tribes and started treating it like a family, started widening the circle of those that were a part of our community? The third thing I think that we have to do though is like not gatekeep. Like this is what Christians do the best. And I don't mean that as a compliment. But it's what we do the best. Like we gatekeep God. We gatekeep community. We gatekeep Jesus. Like you have to think like me and act like me and be like me and come into this space. And like once you believe and behave the right ways, I'll open the gates and you can belong to my God. And what God continually says time and time again is like, that's not how we do this, right? Like, do you remember what I challenged you to do in Leviticus? When I talked to your people that came out of slavery, like, don't just be about yourself. Don't just protect yourself. Don't gatekeep this. Open this up for other people. Create more seats than you're taking away. Like, be about making space for other people. But the last one is maybe the most important, is like learning that we don't love people conditionally. We love people like Jesus. And this is kind of connected to all of these, right? Like, if you're gatekeeping, there's a condition. If you're protecting, there's a condition. If we're fearful, there's a condition, right? And what Jesus is continually doing is putting himself in situations where there are no conditions. Whether that's with Judas, who betrays him, or Peter, who denies him, or Thomas, who doubts him, or the numerous tax collectors who were social pariahs, seen as people that were the enemy by the Roman government and by the Jewish faith. Like, he hung out with the people that were the furthest away from being centered and continually loved them without condition. And I think even though it was the fourth one on this, I think if we reverse engineer this and we just said, we're going to love people without condition, think of how the other things would come. We would have less fear. We would have less anxiety. We would have less protection. We would do less gatekeeping if unconditional love is what flowed from us and who we are. And so my hope for us is during this Christmas season is that we could be people that reflect that kind of embrace that Jesus offers us. But my fear is that the reason we don't do that is not always desire. It's the pace that we live life in, right? Like, sometimes it's really hard to create seats for people if we're sprinting from one thing to the next. It's hard for us to believe we have a seat if we're running around too much to ever sit in it, right? Like, there's oftentimes, it's hard for us to embrace that. And my favorite thing about Advent's like a churchy word, but what Advent means is like a season of anticipation and waiting. And so here would be my challenge for you this Advent, is like exhale a little bit. Like, breathe in and breathe out and like wait and anticipate and hope. And see what happens if this Advent season you don't leave this space and immediately think about all the to-dos that you have to do, all the Christmas shopping you have to start, or the Christmas shopping that you still need to get done, or the people that you have coming into town, or the things you're doing well, or the things that you're not doing. What would happen if you just anticipated it and pondered and waited to see what God is doing and where God might show up this Advent season? And something that we can easily forget about the Advent story is like Mary and Joseph and Zachariah and Elizabeth and everyone that's a part of that story, they didn't have it in front of them, right? They didn't know the story was coming, but they were waiting and they were anticipating, and in a world where it was hard to cling on to hope, they clung on to hope, and the story was found in that anticipation, that preparation, and that waiting. And my hope is for us as we go through this season, if we wait and we anticipate and we hope and we slow down and we breathe, and we might find God in unexpected ways, find the story of Christmas revealed in ways that we never knew possible, and in that find our space more fully, but also be about people that create space for those that were never told they had a seat, that the Christmas story was never for them, and realize that it was never us and them, but it was always a Christmas story that was about us, a story that is not for some, but for all. Would you pray with me? God, I do thank you that this is a story that is not just for a few of us, but for all of us. A Christmas story that is about bringing unexpected and unlikely people to the same table to share a meal, to make friends out of foes, to make family out of those that we never thought we could be in relationship with. God, I just ask that you would continue to soften our hearts to help us find our seat at the table and help others find theirs as well. And so God, be with us as we share in communion, as we continue to worship through song. Be with us in this time, and pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.